In this video, we'll be talking about consumer behavior and preferences. So there's three parts of the chapter on consumer theory. First, we're going to talk about consumer preferences and utility, identifying what a consumer likes to consume. Then we'll talk about consumer budget constraints given a certain income and prices of products, and we'll bring it all together. This video concerns the first part, consumer preferences. So to talk about consumer preferences, first we're going to define what we call market baskets or bundles. And in particular, in this class, we're going to be focusing on two good worlds that we can just graph out on the XY coordinates. All right, so a market basket or bundle is going to be any combination of our two goods. So for example, if our two goods are dinners out and movies, we could have a basket with 2 dinners out and 3 movies. We could have a basket with 5 dinners out and 6 movies. And then what we're going to do is use our preferences to determine which of these market baskets we like better. So some basic assumptions about preferences. First, preferences are complete. That means consumers know how to rank their market baskets. If you have 2 baskets, A and B, then either A is preferred to B is preferred to A, or the consumer is indifferent between the two and likes both exactly the same. Preferences are transitive, so for baskets A, B, and C, if the consumer prefers A to B and B to C, then they must prefer A to C. And finally, more is better than less. We don't have any bads in the world that we're living in. The consumer always wants more of the goods that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so what we can try to do is map out what we call indifference curves. And an indifference curve represents all of the combinations of market baskets or all the purchasing possibilities that provide a consumer with exactly the same amount of satisfaction or happiness, or later in this chapter, we're going to define a utility function. So let's take a look at this chart here. Let's take a look at point A in particular. All right, we can definitely identify by the more is better rule some points that are better than point A. For instance, point E contains both more food and more clothing than point A, so we know that that's better than point A. This better than set includes all of the points which have at least as much clothing and at least as much food or more. And then the baskets here, this is the worse than set. This contains all of the market bundles that contain less than or equal to A food and less than or equal to A clothing. G is clearly worse than A because it has less food and less clothing. All right, but the interesting cases are going to be, how do we compare points like B and H, which have more clothing and less food than A, or point D, which has more food and less clothing? What we need to do is specify utility and create what are called indifference curves. So what's an indifference curve? Once again, an indifference curve is going to show us all of the baskets or purchasing combinations which the consumer likes exactly the same. So this is one sample indifference curve, and there is going to be some mathematical intuition that we'll talk about to these indifference curves in the next video. But what this indifference curve is saying, suppose this was one indifference curve for a consumer, U1, what this is saying is that the point B, 50 clothing and 10 food, provides U1 utility to this consumer, which is the same as 30 clothing and 20 food, also U1, and 20 clothing, 40 food also makes this consumer equally happy. Okay, all of the points that are northeast or this direction are preferred to the indifference curve U1. So we can see clearly that if there was another indifference curve going through this point E, that's going to be preferred to U1. But even points up over here, which are just slightly northeast of U1, are also preferred. Right, likewise, all of the indifference curves, there would be a field of them, one going through point G, that's clearly worse. We know that because G has less food and less clothing. So the consumer is going to like that less. But then even point H, which has less less food but more clothing than A, is comparable. We can say that that's actually less preferred than A. There would be another indifference curve coming through here that's lower or more to the southwest. Okay, so here's what a field or an indifference map looks like. We have these different levels of utility. Every point on U1 provides the consumer some equal amount of satisfaction. So D is exactly the same to this consumer as some point down here, which contains more food and less clothes. U2 is better than that. All of these points are equal to B. U3 is better than that. All of these points are equal to A. So a consumer's clear ranking of preferences between these points would be D is the worst, B is middle, A is the best. Okay, finally, if you have multiple indifference curves, we do have multiple indifference curves mapping out different possible combinations of goods and they cannot cross. To see that, suppose this is just a proof by contradiction. Suppose that it wasn't true. Look at indifference curve U1. Indifference curve U1 is saying that A and B provide the same amount of happiness or satisfaction. The consumer is indifferent between them. Look at U2. That's saying that A and D provide the same amount of satisfaction. So the consumer is indifferent between A and B. They're indifferent between A and D. That means they must be indifferent between D and B. Well, we can see that that can't be true because B has both more clothing and more food than D, so should be clearly preferred. All right, so this is a proof by contradiction that indifference curves cannot cross. All right, so that is our categorization of consumer preferences. Let me know if you have any questions.